Hello, this is Margie Meady, and I'm recording ethical and legal issues that nursing professionals might encounter in the psychiatric mental health setting. Remember that nurses are constantly faced with the challenge of trying to make difficult decisions, and that can be trying to decide between good and evil or life and death, and that there is legislation out there that determines what is right or good within a particular society. So we're going to discuss these types of ethical legal issues in this PowerPoint. So you probably remember when we did pharmacology, I like to always start off with definitions, because if you understand these definitions, then you can apply them to the situations that you might encounter in patient interactions. So ethics is the branch of philosophy that deals with identifying what's the difference between right and wrong. So in a society, what's viewed as right versus what's wrong. And a lot of times people have different opinions about right and wrong, or they try to shade something as being okay. But in the big picture, a lot of times people do have a very similar understanding of what they think is right and what they think is wrong. And then the legal system enforces those definitions. Bioethics is when we're utilizing ethics in the scope of medicine, nursing, or allied health. So that's the kinds of ethical considerations that we deal with in our profession. For example, is it, as I mentioned in the psychotropic medication PowerPoint, we were talking about whether it was okay to give medications that were going to, when a patient did not want to have a medication, but they were really agitated and aggressive and acting out. Is that okay to do that? Moral behavior is the conduct that results from thinking critically about how individuals ought to treat others. So if you think that it's okay to treat someone in a certain way, then that's considered moral behavior. Values are personal beliefs about what is important or desirable. You might think it's very important or desirable to have a higher education, and another person might not think that that's a very important value in their life. Values clarification is when you try to do a self-exploration and identify what you think is important in your life. A lot of times people find themselves doing things that when they think about it, it's not really relevant to their life. And when they identify that it is not and they eliminate it from their life, then it impacts their stress levels. And we've talked a lot about how stress in someone's life can impact their mental health and their physical health. A right is when something is legally recognized as being entitled to a certain person's claim, or they're entitled to a certain right, like the right to vote, or the right to have freedom of not being interfered with and doing things that aren't illegal. So you can rightfully own property, you can rightfully get married, you can rightfully do a lot of different things, and the government is not going to interfere or discriminate against you. The right to practice your religion, all of those things are right, and you are entitled to participate in those actions without having anybody tell you you cannot or interfere with your ability to do those things. An absolute right when there should be no restriction whatsoever on an individual's entitlement. So when we were talking about rights a second ago, if somebody thought that it was their right to practice religion, but their religion, they decided that their religion didn't included something that would harm another person, then that could be governed or interfered with, or somebody might have that restriction placed on them. But an absolute right is when there is no restriction placed on that individual's entitlement to a certain right. A legal right is when the society has agreed or formalized into law things that are okay for an individual to do. So if you get into studying ethics, you understand that there's some theoretical perspectives on how people think about ethics. So you Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that promotes an action based on the end result that produces the most good or happiness for the most people. So that's just a theory that says that if you're doing something and the end result is going to be good for the most people, then that's an okay ethical approach. Kantianism is suggesting that decisions and actions should be bound by a sense of duty. Christian ethics emphasizes that golden rule, we're doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. Natural law theories are referring to doing good and avoiding evil. And human knowledge is the difference between good and evil, which directs somebody's decision making. Ethical egoism refers to making decisions that are based on what's best for the individual that is making the decision versus having a decision based on what's good for somebody else. Some ethical principles that you should be aware of. Autonomy is when somebody has the right to determine what would be best for them. So they are the ones that have their own moral authority to determine what their destiny should be, and that other people should respect it. So we talked about this in pharmacology a little bit. We talked about a patient has a right to refuse a medication. That's demonstrating autonomy. They have a right to refuse it. They have a right to refuse an intervention. So going back to religion and other things that impact somebody's decision making, if somebody was against their religion to accept blood products, they have a right to refuse blood products even if it could cause a harm to their body, and even if it could cause them to have problems and not have the best outcome. That's their right. Beneficence is referring to one's duty to benefit or promote the good of others. Non-malfeasance is when we abstain from doing something negative that could impact another person. We're trying to avoid harming them. So we always are thinking about that in the medical profession. We absolutely have to do no harm. So that's always, you always hear that first, do no harm. In other words, don't do some sort of an intervention that's going to harm an individual patient. Justice is the principle that's based on a hypothetical social contract between a free, rational person, and that concept of justice reflects a duty to treat all individuals equally and fairly. So if you had a patient that had a different kind of background than you had, it would not be fair for you to treat one patient that was similar to you different than a patient that was dissimilar to you. So justice means that all patients or all individuals should be treated equally and fairly. And we do get into some disparities in the healthcare system when we find out that patients from different backgrounds do not have the same access to healthcare, and they really don't have equal treatment if they don't have equal access to the same types of interventions that would benefit their health. Veracity is truth. Veracity means that we are required, it's our duty to be truthful. So if we told a patient what the side effects of the medication were, that's our responsibility to impart to them the truth. So if the patient says, well, are there any side effects that could be detrimental to my health? We have the responsibility to tell them the honest truth about the side effects that they could occur or with any treatment or intervention, not just medications, but we always have to be truthful. So we often give them the benefits of treatments as well as the potential adverse reactions for certain treatments. When patients sign a consent form to have surgery, they are told what we're hoping to gain from having them get this surgery, but they are also told that they could have reactions to anesthesia, they could have complications such as an infection. It's our duty to impart the truth at all times. Ethical dilemmas occur when you can make the case for either of two different courses of action that seem to be in opposition to each other. So when it seems like it could be beneficial to do one course of action, but it could also be beneficial to do another course of action, or it could be, so the example that I gave about giving medications, I mean, if we're giving a medication when somebody is agitated and we're trying to relieve the emotional discomfort or suffering that they're experiencing from their crisis that they're experiencing versus them saying that they don't want medication. So we have a dilemma here. On the one hand, we want to respect their right to autonomy, but on the other hand, we can identify by looking at their behavior that they are suffering from emotional symptoms, and we know that if we give them this medication, it could benefit or alleviate that suffering. So that's a dilemma there. If you take no action, that is considered taking an action. So you've heard that saying, not making a decision is making a decision. So not taking an action is making that decision to not act. Ethical issues in psychiatric mental health nursing, as I mentioned several times, the right to refuse medication and the right to least restrictive treatment alternatives. So sometimes patients are acting out and they have a risk for harming themselves. So there are times when patients need to be restrained and preventing from harming themselves or others. And so that is putting a restriction on their freedom, their physical freedom. So those are pretty common ethical issues in this field of nursing. So a model that people can use for making ethical decisions is to assess what's going on, identify what the problem is, come up with a plan and implement it, and then evaluate it, just like the nursing process always does. And a lot of times there are protocols and policies in place that help you in these situations, and documenting that you've gone through this process is very important, and considering all of these rights that patients do have is very important, and not just doing something because it's easier for you. For example, to restrain a patient or to medicate a patient, rather than to try to do another intervention that could be just as beneficial. So we'll talk about these things further on in the semester, and there are some nice examples. I have some videos that show some ways of approaching patients. You can have an approach that actually agitates a patient and gets them ramped up and then causes them to have to be restrained, or you can use other kinds of successful interventions that de-escalate a situation and therefore preserve a patient's rights. And so if you're assessing the situation appropriately and intervening appropriately, then you will be responding and reacting to patients in an ethical manner. So here are some legal considerations. It's important for nurses to realize that the Nurse Practice Act defines our legal parameters in our profession and our practice of nursing. And so types of laws. We have statutory laws that are those that have been enacted by legislative bodies, such as a county or a city council or a state legislature or even the Congress of the United States. Common law is derived from decisions that are made in previous cases. We have classifications within statutory and common law. Civil law protects the private and property rights of individuals and businesses. Torts are a violation of a civil law in which an individual has been wronged, and torts can be both intentional or unintentional. Contracts enable compensation or performance of an obligation that is set forth in an agreement to be sought. So a contract outlines whether somebody gets paid for performing a certain task or job or activity, and there's an agreement that's binding to who's going to do what. I'm going to do this, I'm going to build your porch, and you're going to pay me this. Criminal law provides protection from conduct that has been deemed injurious to the public welfare. So some legal issues that we encounter in psych mental health nursing is confidentiality and the right to privacy. We all know about HIPAA. That's for any patient, regardless of whether they're in a medical setting or whether in a psychiatric mental health setting. That there's a doctrine of privileged communication, that what patients tell us is privileged. And then an exception would be a duty to warn. So for example, if a patient confided in you that they plan to murder their neighbor or that they plan to commit suicide, then we would have an exception to keeping that confidential. We would have a duty to warn that individual or to take that patient into protective custody if they were claiming they were going to commit suicide. Informed consent is, again, you've dealt with that before in the medical setting, where you're going to explain to a patient what they're agreeing to. So there are certain interventions and procedures that can be done in this specialty area as well that we have to provide informed consent. Restraints and seclusion can sometimes be considered false imprisonment, so we have to consider that legal issue. Commitment issues. Some people will voluntarily admit themselves when they realize that their mental health condition is not stable and they need help in getting regulated and back to baseline. Involuntary commitments occur in emergency situations when the mentally ill person is in need of treatment. We can have an involuntary outpatient commitment, and when we have a patient that's gravely disabled, we can go ahead and have an involuntary commitment. So some other considerations and legal issues in psychiatric mental health nursing is our liability to make sure that we are practicing within our scope of practice, that we don't have any problems with malpractice or negligence. So if we are doing things that aren't covered in our scope of practice, that is malpractice. If we are not doing something that we should be doing in our scope of practice, that is negligence. The types of lawsuits that can occur in psychiatric nurses is a breach of confidentiality. A lot of times patients don't want their diagnosis to be made public, and so that's something that is a very common problem that could occur in this specialty area. Defamation of character. To give you a reminder of what the difference between libel and slander is, libel is a statement that is defamatory that is written down, versus slander is a defamatory statement that is verbally or orally. With slander, you are saying something untrue about somebody that's causing them to have a misrepresentation of them, of who they are. And libel is when you're writing something that is untrue and giving them a bad presentation in that statement or in that comment. Then invasion of privacy is another situation that could occur. Assault and battery, if somebody is in a situation where a patient is, making them uncomfortable, you have to be careful that you don't put yourself in a situation where you feel that your safety is being compromised. And then the false imprisonment we talked about with restraints. So we'll talk about these things in further detail further on in this semester, but a lot of times you do have to think about keeping yourself safe. And so again, we'll talk about these things in other PowerPoint discussions. So as I said, we'll come up with a lot of different case studies and situations that will help you kind of see some of these examples of potential liability situations in action. And this is giving you an outline of things that you can do to avoid liability. If you're responsive to the client, you're providing the appropriate education, if you're making sure you're practicing within the standard of care, your scope of practice, if you're supervising the care that's being provided by other practitioners in the healthcare setting, if you're adhering to the nursing process, you're documenting everything carefully. For example, there's been a lot of lawsuits because patients haven't been checked when they've been in a compromised situation. Maybe they got a medication and somebody didn't follow up and make sure that they were looking for side effects, or they weren't documenting that there were no side effects. There's lots of situations where documentation is really key. Even if you were doing what you needed to do, if you didn't document it, then you don't have a leg to stand on in the court. And then following up is required. And then developing and maintaining a good interpersonal relationship with the client and the family goes a long way. If you have a good relationship with them and they trust you, then they're going to ask when they have questions rather than presuming that you weren't doing the right thing by them. And they're going to come to you and prevent things from happening in the first place, because they're going to report symptoms to you when you have educated them that they need to report different things. And so these are really some good key steps to keep in mind to try to avoid liability. So some practice questions. An operating room nurse asks the psychiatric nurse, "How can you work with a mentally ill day in and day out?" The psychiatric nurse replies, "It's just the right thing to do." This psychiatric nurse is working from which ethical framework? And the correct answer is A, Kantianism, because that focuses on the morality of actions. Actions are judged as right or wrong based on ethical principles, and this nurse's response indicates a Kantian perspective. So as a last resort, an agitated, physically aggressive client is placed in 4-point restraints. The client yells, "I'll sue you for assault and battery." The unit manager determines that the nurses are protected under which condition? And if you need more time, pause it. But the correct answer is A. The client is voluntarily committed and poses a danger to others on the unit. So as a threat to others, the client can be restrained despite objections and voluntary commitment. A nurse gives a client 5 milligrams of haloperidol or Haldol for agitation. The client's chart was clearly stamped that the patient was allergic to Haldol. The client suffered an anaphylactic shock and died. How would the nurse's actions be labeled? The correct answer here is B. The nursing action was an unreasonable, careless act. The nurse was negligent and could be held liable for the client's death. So I hope you have enjoyed this PowerPoint presentation, and I thank you very much for your attention.